really of this panel came from our overall, our Chi Sigma MU's goal of integrating social justice and diversity within our committee. That was our goal. And we really wanted to, and with the guidance of Zeynep too, really develop an initiative for religious and spiritual diversity within counseling, with our mission to kind of normalize and affirm spiritual and religious issues within counseling. And so we kind of are hoping to raise an awareness to develop culturally and ethically competent and responsive service for clients and students from different religious and cultural backgrounds. So we see this panel as really kind of the first step of that initiative, and hopefully we can grow and develop a deeper understanding of our needs and also how to further grow our competencies, hopefully over the next year. So without further ado, I'd like to just take a minute to briefly introduce our moderator, Zeynep. And she is really the one who spearheaded this initiative to integrate our cultural competencies in counseling. She's a first-year graduate student of our clinical mental health program. This is her second semester in the program, and she also has a graduate degree in literature and has experience teaching at the college level as well. And so since starting the program in the fall, Zeynep has joined right on as a volunteer of our committee, even before she was eligible for membership to join our honor society, Chi Sigma Iota. So we're really grateful and appreciative of her work and her efforts. And so she's here to introduce our panelists for us.
Thank you, Mary Rose. You're so kind. It has been my absolute pleasure, everything we've done in the CSI committee. I'm so glad that we were able to put together this panel. I mean, I had one idea, but it was a group effort. So thank you to everyone who took the time to join out of your busy schedules during the spring semester. So without further ado, I would like to get us started. So as Mary Rose mentioned, the main goal of this panel is just to start having conversations about religious and spirituality within the counseling practice, right? So our first question for the panelists is, how does a counselor develop religious and spiritual competence in counseling? Dr. Hillert, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say I'm so glad to be here and just be part of this panel. I think this is a really awesome discussion and so important to have, because I think as counselors, a lot of times we enter the field and we're just so focused on gaining our clinical skills. You know, we want to take all the trainings we can. A lot of times, like we're learning maybe CBT, person-centered counseling, and sometimes paying attention to spiritual aspects of counseling can be neglected. So I think we really have to focus on that area of development if we really want it to make it happen. And just to say a little bit more about why I think it's important, it's really a core value of our profession. It's part of multiculturalism to be affirming and to really see all aspects of our client's identity. And if we're missing spirituality and religion, we can be missing a core part of our clients. So I think it takes a lot of work. I think there's a lot of reflective practice that needs to happen, and just always striving to educate yourself and kind of come from a cultural humility standpoint as well.
Thank you. Dr. Awad, how about you?
There we go. Thanks for the help with the unmuting. I also want to say thank you so much for having me here today. And I really very much love what Dr. Hillard said, and agree very much with the concept of cultural humility and how this is really I was going to say a lifelong process. It might be. It's definitely a career-long process of continuing to really learn and understand all the types of, all the different aspects of the people that we work with. Your question was about how do we keep doing that? And really the answer is you keep doing that, to put it plainly. And what I mean by that is, you know, I'm reminded of this course that we have here for our Stanford residents on religion and culture and psychiatry. And it's so interesting that with every cohort that comes in, there's always this discussion of like, do we really need to be here? Do we really need to be talking about this? And it's like, yes, you really do need to, and let me explain to you why, you know. And by the end of it, there's often this this kind of almost like a revelation that happens to people, because what we do is we actually put them in the hot seat and say, if you were the client or patient, you know, let's ask these very questions to you, which is really opening up a big, pretty huge can of worms. But my sense of this is, if you're going to be taxed with doing this for your own clients or patients, then what would happen, or what would it feel like if we turned the tables and had you do it for yourself first? And that's very empowering many times, but it's also very, I think, enlightening. and then there's that sense of like, wow, I didn't know what I didn't know, and the work continues.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Gosling?
Yeah, I think those are wonderful, very thorough answers. So what I would include maybe is thinking about the ways in which you've already developed your spirituality or your religiosity, depending on where you come from and who you are, because all of us, whether you identify as atheist, agnostic, or anything else, you do in fact have a spiritual component to you that is important to tap into as you work with folks. To Dr. Hiller's point about cultural humility, that's always important. And Dr. Awad's point about kind of reflecting as if you're in the client seat. What does it mean for you? But as counselors too, to remember that you have a life experience as well. You have a history as well. And there is spirituality in that. I mean, it depends on how you kind of want to quantify that or qualify it. But to me, every one of us already has a certain level of spiritual development to tap into as a natural resource that we have to work with clients. So in addition to the very important things that they mentioned, remembering too that no matter what your kind of paradigm is through which you're moving and thinking, that you ultimately do have some experience of spirituality and transcendence in your life. And no matter what that is, and no matter how you want to phrase it, it's something that you can use to connect with clients who come from kind of more traditional religious backgrounds.
Yeah, that's a great point. Robert, how about you?
Well, I like to say it's really important to know and understand the competencies. As you probably all know, there are 14 of them, but to use them as a guide and a benchmark for our professional growth and continuing education. And I think it's really having self-awareness of our level of knowledge and skills, and really we need to really develop comfort and skill in talking about religion and spirituality. And I think it's important to have a general knowledge of the religious landscape and cultural knowledge about cultural norms, such as eye contact, and then practice. But also, I think it's important to engage in reflection on our practice as well, and to really use supervision and consultation for our growth. I really liked the Cashwell and Young book, Integrating Spirituality and Religion into the Counseling, the second edition, because they go through each of the competencies and have questions for reflection and what have you. And just reading that and working through that was very helpful to me a couple of years ago.
Yeah, thank you. What a great start. So, as the moderator, I forgot to introduce our panelists before I jumped into the first question. So I would like to take time to do that. You can tell I'm very excited, so sorry about that. So I want to start with Dr. Hillert. Dr. Hillert received his doctorate in counseling in 2020, and his dissertation was on the use of mindfulness and meditation in prison settings. He currently works as a substance use counselor in Richmond, Virginia. He is Jewish and was raised in a religious household and comes from a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. Meditation and mindfulness are a huge influence in his personal life and now his professional life as well that he shares with his clients. Overall, he's passionate about including religion and spirituality, meditation, and mindfulness in his work because it can be extremely rich and healing for clients. Dr. Gosling received his MA in pastoral counseling at Loyola University, and he later obtained his PhD in counselor education supervision at the College of William and Mary. He currently works as a college counselor as well as an adjunct faculty member. He is a counselor at a private practice, mostly working with veterans and young adults. Before his counseling career, Dr. Gosling was a soldier who served in the Iraq War. Although Dr. Gosling doesn't identify specifically with a particular religion, he has experience studying multiple religious and spiritual practices, including but not limited to Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. He feels that spirituality can be shown in many different ways across clients, and he believes that addressing religion and spirituality in counseling is important in understanding the goals and values of the client. Pastor Rogers currently serves as a pastor of the Church of God in Christ in Morristown, New Jersey. He started his career in counseling by practicing pastoral counseling, serving as a hospital chaplain, hospice chaplain, and pastor. He then earned his master's in counseling in 2012 from Montclair State, where he is currently a doctoral candidate. He's also a licensed associate counselor in New Jersey. He believes that religion and spiritual identity are just as important as other social identities, for they have a huge influence on mental health. Last but not least, Dr. Awad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she's also the director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, associate chief of the Division of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and the co-chief of Diversity and Cultural Mental Health Section. She is currently a senior fellow at Yaqeen Institute and ISPU. In addition, she serves as the director of the Rahma Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. She has previously served as the founding clinical director of the Halil Center, San Francisco, as well as the professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College. Prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria, and holds certifications of Ijaza in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic sciences. So, as we can see from these bios, there is a reason why we invited these 4 panelists, and I feel so grateful to learn from your expertise. So to kind of recap, you 4 touched upon different ways of how we can work on our cultural competence when it comes to religion and spirituality. So we talk about broaching in our classes a lot regarding race and culture, and kind of bringing these conversations to the counseling session. We see broaching as the cultural competence we gain translated into action and practice within the session and the counseling relationship. So regarding this, how would we then broach religion and spirituality in a counseling session? Can you give a few examples of how that competence we can see that in the relationship itself? Dr. Awad, can you start us off?
Sure, thank you. Often I work with Muslim patients, but certainly a variety of different folks as well. And what I find is that going in a very non-judgmental, no assumptions, nothing at all, realizing too that I appear as an observant Muslim or identifiable Muslim, if you will, and understanding that dynamic as well. But I go in with no assumptions really. And when we start the session, and those intake sessions are really, really key. And often they span beyond just the first week. But within those sessions, I try to find where there might be a place to be able to ask questions that then, might enlighten me about where the person's standing is. It's really important to remember that when we talk about faith, spirituality, religion, there's an entire spectrum of practice and what it is that people, take away, and whether it's supportive or not supportive. Mentioning resources and books, Dr. Harold Koning's book of Religion That Helps and Religion That Harms is also a very useful, I think, resource to look at, because it really does talk about, is there support coming from this? Because as a clinician, that's really what you want to find out and kind of build towards rapport, and even bring into your basically resources that you can depend on as well for the person. Or if it's been a place of really a lot of trauma and difficulty, that's important to really understand as well. And so for me, when I work with a Muslim patient, I might just sort of start off in the midst of asking about social history and backgrounds and, a person's upbringing and who's been within family and who they identify as their loved ones and so on, and support systems. That usually helps me start to just build a picture. And it may not be in that very first session, but close to the beginning, I tend to try to ask about the questions on whether this has been supportive or not to them. And then try to understand, what does community mean? And what does family mean? Those are usually very telling questions that elicit a lot for you to build up on.
Yeah, from what I hear, it sounds like it's a long process. That's not just what solved with 1-2 questions or within the first session, right? Dr. Gosling, how about you?
Well, I love Dr. Awad's answer there. There's not much I would say beyond what was shared there. The community and family are critical to asking and then engaging around the ideas of spirituality and religiosity, because that's ultimately some of the most important facets of the human existence, right? And often are very, very much intertwined with that component of life. I would say it's important, for me to do it during the intake, no matter what, right? Is not necessarily so that I know, but because it's important. It's important to recognize, at least to me as a practitioner, that it is in fact a very, very critical component of the human experience for most individuals, for the majority of people in the world. And so to ask it as kind of a regular part of the intake that you do, no matter where you work, signifies to your clients as well that this is a priority. I put this as a priority among the other things that I'm asking you about in your history or your ongoing experience. This is something that I value, and it's signaling to your client as well that you are a person that values that particular facet of experience. And I've noticed the more you do that and the more you speak it into existence up front with clients, the more responsive they are to it in general. And they see that, as Dr. Awad has pointed out, you come with that non-judgmental attitude about their experiences. And also what she said in terms of the spectrum of reality of religiosity, right? That, people can be in the same religious tradition, have very, very different experiences, very different belief systems, right? So it's important for you to take the individual components given to you by your client as a unique person with a unique experience and a unique belief system all together, and kind of put that into practice when you're visualizing your forward progression and movement with a client, right? You want to visualize that holistically, like Dr. Hillard said in the first question. And so as long as you're bringing it up early with a client, I think it's very important. And then you're signifying the weight of that particular facet of life in relation to how you see everything.
Yeah, Robert, you seem to agree with him. Would you like to add
Yeah,
anything?
I love it. I love it. I love both answers. And I just want to piggyback on Dr. Gosling's answer, because for me, the starting point is at intake and on the informed consent and disclosure forms, where we are asking about spirituality and religion. So this is like you're extending an invitation or trying to open the door to let clients know that these social identities are important. And it's also to let them know it's okay if they want to talk about spirituality and religion. And I think during that assessment process, we try to have a clear understanding of all of the client's social identities. And that's why this panel is so important. We focus a lot on race, on gender, sexual orientation. But what is of equal importance to me is spirituality and religion. And so we can also ask questions, to find out, one, how important this topic is for the client. So how important is spirituality and religion for you? Do you want to talk about this in our work? What sustains you during difficult times? What gives you meaning and purpose and joy? And what are you grateful for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are implicit forms of assessment. I also think we have to go beyond the intake form. So if I have a Black male client who puts on the form Baptist, what does that tell me? The only thing it tells me is that he knows how to spell Baptist. It doesn't tell me if he's active in the church, what his practices are. He may have been a child that was brought to the Baptist church when he was 5, but then after age 10, he never has set foot in a church, but Baptist is a socially acceptable answer. So we really have to move beyond intake forms and really explore with the client the importance of spirituality and religion for them.
Yeah, and I assume that for counselors to do this, as you said, it's an invitation for the client to then be comfortable talking about these within the session. And I imagine it's very difficult for some people to just bring it up on their own. So I bet that invitation really helps with them.
Yeah, if I could also just say, we as counselors need to have comfort in bringing up these topics as well. Just as we have comfort in talking about race and racism, we need a level of comfort in talking about spirituality and religion. Again, as Dr. Awad and Dr. Gosling has said, in a non-judgmental sort of way.
Definitely. Dr. Hillard?
Yeah, I think if I could only add a couple points, I think maybe just I think it's been said, the importance of just asking open questions and really, what is, how is this important to you in your life right now? How could this be important to your mental health and your recovery journey? The process of counseling, really empowering the client to speak on it. And if we don't ask the question, they're not gonna answer. So a couple tools that I really like using are the wellness wheel, because that does have that domain of spiritual wellness, and you can incorporate it with all those other areas that maybe they think they think they're coming to just talk about maybe their emotions. They think they're coming just to talk about whatever pressing difficulties they have. But if we can kind of open their eyes to how spirituality could be involved in their mental health, I think that can be really important. And yeah, so that just kind of bringing that to the conversation, some assessments even to talk about it, and maybe even talking about, defining spirituality like we've talked about, with values, beliefs, and not just like Robert said, I'm Baptist, but really like, what are your values, purpose? For clients that maybe don't identify with the religious group, talking about just what spirituality means, and maybe providing a definition of that for clients that maybe have never, that kind of are consider themselves atheist or agnostic, but being able to just talk about that, provide education, I think we can do that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that ties really well into our next question. And I think Dr. Wan kind of talked about how religion and spirituality, we have to imagine it as a spectrum, right? So whether you work with a client who identifies with a similar religious or spiritual background to you or not, everyone's religious and spiritual identity is so different. So how do you engage with a client whose beliefs and values regarding religion and spirituality are different than yours? Dr. Gosling, can you start us off, please?
Sure. So, looking at that question, I feel like it's asking the same thing as, how do you work with a client who's different than you, right? Because ultimately there's going to be differences no matter how much you share in common with somebody in terms of the religiosity or spiritual components. And so that's really important to acknowledge up front. And that, as Pastor Rogers pointed out, it's a process that unfolds through the duration of counseling. So there are a variety of ways in which you can approach that as you kind of gain rapport and trust with that client. So there's things obviously you wouldn't ask at the beginning that you can then ask later, and vice versa, right? So there's some things you might ask up front, and then later you don't need to ask it again, but you can kind of get into more of the nuance and the details of it. But ultimately asking them, right, about their experiences to share with you. And then, a long-term projection, if you have a lot of foundation with somebody, maybe even speaking about, your experiences as a form of self-disclosure around whatever component of religion that you're discussing with them. Because if you're noticing your discomfort with it, for instance, to even broach the subject, then maybe that's part of how they've been experiencing the world as well, or people around them in the world, depending on, what part of society they come from, et cetera. So if you're having a particular experience of difficulty or awkwardness, feeling like, I don't know how to talk about this, I don't want to talk about it, then maybe other people are experiencing that as well, and they've had that as part of their life history. Sorry, dog's barking.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Robert, how about you?
Well, I think it's important for us to really have cognitive empathy. That is the capacity to understand another person's state of mind from their perspective. I mean, to understand their beliefs and what they mean for the client, and explore what the relationship of those beliefs are, if there are any, to the presenting problem. And how do their beliefs influence their thoughts, their feelings, lifestyle. And I really encourage clients to educate me. And I become teachable. And I treat the client as the expert. And then help them engage in reflection on what they have shared with me.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely so. Dr. Hillard?
I think that what really becomes really important for me is just doing it with a sense of genuineness and authenticity, not pretending to be something I'm not. Like, I don't think you would ever want to do that as a counselor, but at the same time, being like flexible and understanding of how important religion and spirituality can be to our clients, and really affirming that, and just like being like being able to say amen when a client says a prayer. Like, it might not be of my faith, but I can still say amen. I can still see how important that is, like that cognitive empathy, and really affirm that. And even if that's not my personal religious or belief system, I can still connect to that common spiritual core. And I think that becomes so important when, it can just mean so much to clients to let them know, like, yes, I'll pray for you if that's what they request. Just be willing to be comfortable with that, and not say, oh, that's not within the confines of my professional role, but have some understanding and flexibility. Obviously, I would never do things that I don't have the competency to do. I would never guide a client in their religious prayers or practices if I'm not of that tradition. But I can ask them, is there anything in your tradition that would be helpful to the struggle that you're going through right now? Or I can help them find, if they're not connected to a congregation, I could help them look in their area for that. But just being genuine, authentic, but also being flexible and trying to meet clients where they're at.
Definitely. I remember in one of my therapy sessions, we were trying to replace one of my negative self-talks with a positive one. And my therapist asked me, like, what sentence would you like to then say to yourself? And I included the word inshallah in it. And I was just about to explain it. And she said, oh yeah, I know that. That means hopefully. She had a Jewish background. And that small moment of her knowing what that word meant just like made me trust her so much more. It was such a nice experience. So as you said, like we can't know everything about every religion, but just asking our clients and having them educate us in a humble way, I think, is a great way to do this. How about you, Dr. Wan?
Thanks for that story, Zainab. That's really great. And because I agree with so much of what everyone has said, maybe I can share just a small anecdote for me that might be a useful kind of learning moment. And, for me, I considered myself, and fairly well read on various religions and faiths, but there's still a whole lot more to learn and know. And our patients are so great at always reminding us that and teaching us that. Our clients, sorry, as a MD, I typically say patients, so you guys get the change in lingo there. Anyhow, the first time I had a patient who was from the Jain background, it was so interesting, and I thought, okay, yeah, I think I know a bit about this, right? But this is really important to not assume and to not kind of go forward, as mentioned. And as she was talking, and a lot of it, what she came in for was not faith-based at all, but rather it was, she was a new mom and she was expecting again, and there was a lot of life balances that she was going through, and we were just talking about life-work balance. Really was really the gist of the work we were doing. And at some point I said something like, would it be helpful if you had, cooked meals that were frozen, so that you can easily pull them later, thinking it was really kind of an innocuous, like, thing that you might say for somebody who's talking about work-life balance, right? And she just stopped and looked at me and she said, I can't do that. And so I was frankly really lost in the moment and needed to kind of take a step back and, kind of do the, help me understand why not, right? And through that conversation, there was a whole lot of discussion related to, nuances that I hadn't really picked up on or really connected on, the microorganisms, and, that led into the discussion of like garlic and onions and things that she can't eat, even if she's vegetarian. I mean, there's just so much nuance there that there's no way I could have remembered, I think, all of those details. But in the process of doing that, there was a certain amount of her sharing and educating me, but also being very mindful not to tax her with doing a lot of education for where I was missing some information. So I took what she was able to give and then did a whole lot of my own reading afterwards so that I was more prepared in coming sessions, And in that moment too, one more thing I'll share is finding the right moment to share but not overshare about your own self. So I really did find a moment, and actually clicked pretty well, to talk about my own kind of dietary practices or restrictions that was, helped align the conversation a little bit more. And like you mentioned, Zainab, I felt that there was like thankfully, kind of a click there. There was a trust factor that was built, a rapport that was built with a whole lot of just cultural humility and not apologizing, balancing without apologizing for what you don't know, but also not overstating and being like, oh yeah, I know all about that, when that's not really the case either. So hope that was useful.
Yeah, and I think I can't speak for all religions, but I know that as a Muslim, I'm used to feeling weird in the United States, right? Because some of like my spiritual practices compared to Western values, they're just different, right? So I feel like even in that moment, for her to be able to say, I can't do that, and then not have to defend herself and not having to like feel weird and to be understood instead, I think there's just such great value in that as well. So I think we are now at one of our favorite questions. So we've been talking a lot about religious and spiritual identity, but as counseling professions, we know that someone's part of their identity doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So how does intersectionality of your clients' religious and other identities influence your counseling practice? And I would like Robert to start us off, please.
Oh, okay, where shall I begin? I think in our mental health and spiritual assessments, it's really important to explore and understand the intersection of our clients' social identities up front, and to really understand the intersectional realities of their lived experiences. I mean, I think we need, and you know, I was struck when I read this question. I think it's the case in every client that we use an intersectionality lens to really understand the unique combination of their social identities, and which creates a unique self with specific lived experiences. And I think we have to acknowledge and honor the complexity and diversity within each client that we work with, and how this intersectionality creates what it creates, and especially the challenges the client may experience. So, for example, if you take a Black gay man who attends a Black Baptist church, he faces um, a number of religious challenges in his participation in that congregation. Um, so, I mean, there is a certain level of complexity when we talk about intersectionality that we really have to really explore and be sensitive to, and just not really look at surface stuff or whatever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Dr. Hillert, anything you would like to add?
Definitely. I think, you can't understate the importance of bringing intersectional focus and being open and processing with clients all aspects of their identity and how they experience that in their everyday life. And just having an understanding and doing, all the work we can to educate ourselves, but then not making assumptions with that education we do. And just, again, bringing everything back to cultural humility, being open and finding ways to stay committed to our values, to try to address any power imbalances as they might come up in counseling, and to be an advocate to help our clients advocate for themselves. And I think it's something, the work never stops, especially, coming from a privileged perspective, that I always have to educate myself about issues, marginalization, experiences that people are facing, and just always try to do better and understand, if I'm making a microaggression, try to learn, what I did and how to correct that so it doesn't happen again. And having just open dialogue. So I'm always doing that work on yourself.
Yeah, I've heard one lesson that I'm taking away from this panel is how much I've heard from you all the word humility, right? So that's, I think, such an important part of being a good counselor then. Dr. Awad, anything you would like to add?
I agree so much with Pastor Robert's mention of the intersectional lens and how that's important to really think about all the various aspects of the client in the room. And maybe ones that we may have not picked up on immediately right away either. I think about how some of the folks that I've worked with I'm thinking right now specifically of a person who I just found her words so powerful. So I'll share them with you. It was around the time of the travel ban, and she was one of our Stanford students. Actually went public with this, but she really taught me actually a lot of what this means to have all these different intersections. And with the very short story of a very complicated story is that she was caught uh, uh, doing her dissertation work in the Sudan when the travel ban happened, was trying to get on her way back. And unfortunately, the executive order was signed into effect within, unfortunately, she was supposed to be back here before it was signed into effect, but she just couldn't make it back. And she got stuck actually in New York at JFK. And long story short, she talks about how the 4 identities that she considers to be her identifiers were the very 4 targeted, or some of the targeted in this ban. And she talks about how she is Black, and that she's Muslim, and that she's an immigrant, and that she's a woman. And that those various identities together really did not, despite all of her successes and despite all the great things, her Harvard education and her Stanford, PhD and her this and that, and pulling herself up by her own bootstraps as an immigrant who came alone to this country as, a high schooler from Sudan, and built her way through, none of that was taken into consideration. And she was sort of swept up with everybody else by a very indiscriminating, ban. And how it really made me think and reflect in that moment of, wow, like there could be identities that a person comes in with that not only in this case we talk about, I know your group is on social justice and how important that is, and thinking about sometimes there are identities that are not under attack, but in her case each and every one of them were, in the last administration, hopefully it gets better going forward, but this is where she's at. And therefore the lens and her PTSD and the re-triggering of it all from that incident was a very different treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder than talking to somebody who maybe was a war veteran or somebody who had, another traumatic event that happened in their life. These identities shaped everything in the work we were doing. And I think that's where that lens becomes really important to take into consideration.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, Dr. Wan. Dr. Gosling, anything you would like to add about intersectionality?
Not much. Those are very thorough answers. I love that anecdotal story too. Very powerful. I think the basic thing that I thought about with that question as everyone was speaking was kind of, you have to actually notice the intersectionality first, right? And so if you haven't done any of the work that everybody's been recommending people do on their own time rather than burdening clients with it, you might not notice some of these things and they might not tell you. So really, like, everybody who's here today is attempting to further their knowledge about intersectionality with spirituality and religiosity. And there's so many other ways in which that is apparent and manifest in the world around us. But ultimately, as professional counselors and professional healers in general, we have an obligation to inform ourselves about some of the fundamental ways in which our society has these concerns and issues, and the ways that the people like, the person that Dr. Watt was just describing are influenced by the way that our society treats these components of intersectionality. And as Dr. Hillard mentioned, the ways in which those of us moving from places of privilege are also aware of how that comes into the client room, right, into the client session, and how that might be having an overt impact on them and their ability to even talk to us about some of those components of intersectionality. Because if I sat down with a person that Dr. Awad meets with as an Iraq war vet, right, and I don't tell them about my history with Sufism or Islam or anything like that, I'm pretty sure they're not going to speak to me the same way, right? There's not going to be the same level of comfort there. And so that's important for me to recognize, right? It's not their job to figure out why they're having a reaction to me. It's my job to figure out what's going on and then ask them about their experiences. And if they want to share, they want to share, but to not put the expectation on our clients to have all of those things figured out, or to know with perfect clarity what's going on in the space between the two of us. I mean, that's why we're getting paid money, is to, in part, to figure those things out and to help them kind of elucidate their feelings about it and how to make meaning and purpose out of those intersectional components.
Yeah, what a great answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Gosling. That was great. So I want to get to the Q&A, but I want to ask this one last question because I'm curious about it. Because we had a question about like common themes, but you guys did such an amazing job connecting each other's answers that I didn't have to do it as a moderator. So I'm going to skip that question and get to the last one, which is, so a lot of us are counselors in training. So if possible, we would like you to time travel back a little bit to when you started counseling and talk about some small thing that surprised you, if possible. Dr. Awad, do you want to start us off? I see you thinking, but.
Oh yes, I was definitely thinking there. Do you mean surprise me about the training or the process, or what do you mean?
About your clients, about counseling, whatever comes to mind.
Oh wow, okay. I would say, I don't know if this is very useful, but I would say probably the most surprising thing to me, and I hope this is can transfer forward. But I was so surprised of how people were finding it useful talking to me, which I really did not think would be the case. You know, there's a whole lot of, you know, there's all these words that we use about feeling like you don't really belong in this, and you're kind of this imposter, right? The imposter syndrome, and oftentimes wondering, you know, am I really doing this right, or am I just talking? Like, what is this exactly? What is this therapeutic process that is really happening here? But over the years and over time, I guess I can sort of report here that it's a whole lot more than just talking, and it's a whole lot more. I mean, people, when they come back and are actually able to say, here are very objective measures that have changed from our discussion, or here are how things have gotten better, or I've grown, or you notice that growth. You know, it is incredibly gratifying, and it makes you want to get up the next day and do this all over again with more people. Do you know what I mean? So I guess that's one thing. I was very surprised of not only, I mean, I guess the imposter part is not surprising, but I was surprised that this therapy works. And I could probably say a whole lot more about that, but I'll just say one last thing, which is that, and I think some of that comes from just my own upbringing, my own cultural background of people saying, what is this therapy thing? Do you really think this really works? So I think I had internalized some of that and really wondered if it was actually doing anything. But happy to report that that's not the case, and that it actually is helpful, hopefully, to some people that we work with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've been, to all my Muslim friends, I've been fighting against that, saying, look, I tried it, it really works. Please believe that it works, even if you don't do it. But yeah, I get that a lot. How about you, Dr. Gosling? Were you able to time travel and find a memory?
Well, I don't know about a memory, but I'll say up front, we're all counselors in training, right? That never stops. So it's important to maintain that kind of beginner's mind in the Zen world, right? Of I'm always a beginner. I'm always just learning how to do it, right? And that those of you who are technically in the training are already, in fact, counselors, because you're healers by nature. That's how you got into this program. So every single one of you has a background, I'm guessing, in which you were like the good listener of your friend group, or people came to you with problems or whatever, right? What is that indicative of, right? You're already healers. You were born to be healers. So you don't need a degree to be a healer and called to that journey, right? That's already who you are. There's no beginning and there's no end to that. But to always have that mentality of, okay, whatever fancy stuff they give me, right? It doesn't really mean anything. I have to be open to possibility in every single moment, and I have to constantly cultivate that sense of like, I'm just beginning to figure it out. You know, I'm just learning. I'm on the journey too, right? Everybody, we're all unfinished products, and that's kind of the beauty of it. To the question, I guess, in addition to what Dr. Watt said, which is very true, was the shock of it working. I think I was also shocked by the impact it had on me. So, for those of you who are HSPs or empaths, highly sensitive people or empaths, which is a lot of us in the healing professions, be very cognizant of the ways in which counseling takes your energy, right? And so for me, I had to kind of cultivate a sense of boundaries in which, all right, I'm at work and now I'm not at work, and I'm going to drop the things from work and try to re-energize myself away from that space. And that's the reason that a full caseload for most people isn't 40 clients or even 30 clients, right? Because it takes a lot of your energy to do this work. And it's important for you to recognize that up front and quickly, so that you can put things into place for yourself to be okay, and to not burn out of the profession within 5 or 7 years, which is the average for a lot of folks, right? So do the things now that you can do to take care of yourself so that later on you stay in this profession and you become the mentors and guides for the next generation of people coming, because it's important that we have those people. So
Yeah, thank you for bringing up self-care. It's so important. Robert, you're ready to go.
Yeah, I just want to say amen to Dr. Gosling, because the thing that struck me was how emotionally and physically draining the counseling process is, and really the need for self-care. And again, that's ongoing. I mean, I really haven't learned it completely, but I'm trying to practice it. Practice self-care as much as possible. I was really helped by Gerald Corey's book, him and like three or four other folks on counselor self-care. That's an excellent book. If a person wants to read it.
Thank you. And Dr. Hillert?
I think something that surprised me is like how much I could really rely on intuition, because we learn counseling is like both a science and an art. And if I could really just listen to my clients, I am going to know what to say. Something I struggled with a lot at first is just knowing what to say, especially when clients are bringing up such heavy things. But learning how that I can trust my intuition, and sometimes you have the best insights and build rapport the best way when you can really learn to just listen and rely on that.
Yeah, definitely.
If I could just piggyback on that, I mean, I view the counseling process really as a spiritual process. I mean, we talk about it as being transformative and providing meaning for people, et cetera, et cetera. And so, at least for my own perspective, I rely on spirit to inspire and inform my counseling during the counseling process.
Yeah, definitely so. So I don't know how many times I can say thank you to really reflect how grateful I am for this panel. I learned so much in the past 40 minutes than I imagined. So thank you so much. And I really hope that this is, as we said, the first step, and that we can host many more events like this so that we can really just gain that cultural competence and also find that comfort that Dr. Gosling talked about to bring up these issues and really reflect on our own identity. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Suni for the Q&A. And as we mentioned, Dr. Awad is only going to be here for about 10 more minutes. So if anyone has any questions for her, that would be great if we can start that off.
Yeah, and before we get started with the Q&A, can we have a quick round of applause for our panelists and for Zainab for doing such an amazing job?
Yeah, and also, sorry, Suni. Dr. Awad also mentioned a book that she recommended that I missed. So if you could repeat that, Dr. Awad, maybe we can find that.
Sure. There's actually a number of books that might be useful. The one I mentioned is Religion That Heals and Religion That Harms.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Someone can type that in the chat, I
If
hope.
anyone wants to raise their hand or chat, you got it, Suni.
Yes. Yeah. So just to organize this a bit, again, like Zainab said, we have just a few minutes with Dr. Awad. So just to be equitable, if anyone has any specific questions to direct to Dr. Awad, we can definitely start that way. Feel free to use the reactions, the raise hand, or if you'd like to unmute, feel free to do that as well. Or if you're uncomfortable speaking, drop a question in the chat. I'll be happy to vocalize that for you. So who would like to get us started off? Always that awkward silence. Yeah, Tiana, go for it.
Hi. I had a question that I think is something I struggle a little bit with. And it's a little overarching. It's not necessarily only dealing with spirituality and religion, but can also, be related to that. How do you, or have you ever encountered someone who you think is maybe stereotyping you or is having like a specific reaction to you? And how do you go about addressing that, if at all?
And is that question for Dr. Awad?
Yes, and then whoever else, but yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Awad, please.
Sure, happy to start, and thanks, Jana, for the question. And the answer is yes, certainly. In fact, I would say what's been most difficult are not always the clients, but sometimes the supervisors.
Mhm.
I think I've had more struggle there, honestly, than I have with my own clients. Interestingly enough, if I'm going to just speak very, very, plainly here. It's been a, and I'll just say just very quickly, I had one who actually in our very first session, lovely person, but in our very first session said something to the effect of like, to be in this field, you have to be a blank slate, and you are not a blank slate. And I was like, oh dear, okay, here we go. So it was a very, it'll probably take me a good half hour to explain all of that, but I think you guys get the gist of where that was going and how complicated that was. And I think since then in every class that I've taught, I'm like, we are not blank slates, just as like a reaction to that, situation. And she's right, I'm not a blank slate, but I did not agree with that I don't belong here. I can't do this work, right? Nonetheless, your question was more about clients, I think, and I just went on my little rant, forgive me. But the discussion on, I have to say this, and part of our training in where I trained at Stanford is we do partly work in our outpatient clinics, but part of the work is actually at the VA in the Veterans Administration. And I've had some really interesting interactions, you guys can probably imagine, being a hijab wearing woman in a setting that is all male veterans who were from OIF, basically the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And everything from, hey, this is great, I don't mind you being my doctor, to taking one look at me and going, oh hell no, and like storming off, right? And then needing to figure out like, what am I going to do with this? There have been moments that have been very scary, honestly, because we're talking about trauma and people that are getting triggered, and I'm worrying about, am I triggering that person? And again, having supervisors that are like, no, you're going to be the person who's going to work with this client regardless, and not, there's no give there, especially when you're a trainee and you don't have a lot of say. So it's been interesting. And I think what I've learned is that empathy, compassion, always being as safe as you possibly can be, obviously, but at the same time, sometimes the most unexpected things happen too, and the being patient through it, and then eventually getting to a point of rapport where you feel like you can address the elephant in the room and actually say, hey, I realize this is really triggering for you, and can we talk about that, right? Sometimes you actually do get to that point if the person's willing to go there with you. Sometimes that never happens. You know what I mean? In the moments where it has been able to happen, I've had some really great experiences, actually mutual experiences, where I have let go of some of my own clearly internalized issues related to working with somebody who I felt, I'll tell you very quickly, this is a little, I guess trigger warning here, but, I had a patient lean over the table one day and go, why do you want to just talk? Why do you want to be my doctor? And I was sort of like, I don't really have a choice, right? But in reality, he was like, look, I'm not a light switch. You can't just flip me on and flip me off. 24 hours before I got on a plane, came back here, I killed a woman who looks like you. And I was like, oh dear, okay, here we go. There's just a whole lot there that needed to be unpacked and worked with. And that same person, though, over the weeks that we worked together, he had such a real change in his perception, and so did I, both ways. And it was very powerful. And one day I promise I'll try to write about this, because there was so much affect there that was kind of pouring out on both sides. But I'm telling this very long-winded story to really just say, sometimes you have to sort of stick it out and find that right moment when you feel like rapport has been built to address. And sometimes it's a losing battle and it's not really going to happen. So hopefully that was comprehensive enough.
Yes, it definitely was. Thank you. And I was talking about clients, but really I don't have that many at this point. So the places I've experienced it first are supervisors. So that actually, you read my mind.
And we're mindful, Dr. Awad, of your time. I know we're hitting that 5 o'clock mark. And I just want to build on that and say that I think supervisors, that can be a challenge there, right? Because at some point their training stops. they go and get CEs, but how much are they really in the classroom learning about, religion and spirituality? But before we let you go, Dr. Awad, thank you so much again for your candor, for all of your wonderful insight, for your expertise. We are so grateful, the Montclair State community. We're so grateful for your time.
I'm so happy to have been here with you and shared this time and shared with all the panelists. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate that. Dr. Gosling, Dr. Hillard, Pastor Robert, I really, really appreciate all of this time. And I just want to apologize and say I'm so sorry that Thursday is like clinic day for me. And so I only have this 1 hour and I have to run, unfortunately. But thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Awad. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
All right. So we have just about 15 minutes. Any other questions for our wonderful panelists? We're doing that dance again. Who's going to speak up?
I guess I'd like to go back to a theme that we've talked about, and we've been really talking about the integration of spirituality and religion into counseling. And I really would like to hear from the panelists on what integration means. And for me, it means that we are doing our counseling work primarily and not spiritual work. And we are addressing spiritual and religious issues as they pertain to the presenting problems and issues that clients bring to us. So I'd like to hear from other panelists your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Dr. Hillard, would you like to start us off?
I can try. That's such a great question. In a way, it kind of depends on what we define spirituality as, because if we're looking at it more broadly, it's like all dimensions of being human. So if I'm working with someone on kind of addressing negative core beliefs, we could say that's in a way a spiritual intervention. At a deeper, maybe we're integrating spiritual coping and talking about prayer and meditation. And as was mentioned, mindfulness is something I like to integrate a lot with clients, about just being able to tap into the here and now as a coping skill. But then there's a spiritual dimension to that as well, especially with meditation and mindfulness. And it just comes up a lot with clients. A quote that comes up a lot is, prayer is talking to God and meditation is listening. And that is really, I think a lot of clients resonate with that when I'm introducing meditation that have a faith background. So many different ways of integrating.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you, Dr. Hillard. Dr. Gosling, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, that's such a great topic. I'm not sure what to add. I guess to me, it's a lot of what's already been said in terms of constantly cultivating your own framework through which to view the work. So obviously Pastor Rogers, for instance, has a very clear framework from which he does the work. That is, it's a spiritual endeavor, right? And the more that you can become clear about what it means to you, the counseling process, being a counselor, being a healer, the things that you do with people, I think the better the work will be for you. The more you'll feel connected to it, the less you'll feel disengaged from it at times that become difficult, because we all go through difficult periods working with certain kinds of folks and whatever else comes along for you. So if you can have that clarity and cultivate that clarity about, what am I even doing here? Like, what is this about? Is this just because I like talking to people, or is it something deeper? And it's something deeper, right? That's the answer. And so to me, like, we're all just waves on the one ocean, right? We're all just waves, but we're all part of the ocean. And so it's the oneness of all of reality ultimately. And I'm just serving other facets of the oneness by dealing with other people, no matter what I'm doing in life. And so counseling is just a particular facet of doing that. And it's a particular facet of celebration of oneness, right? Where there really is no difference between you and me. We're all part of the same thing. And if I can help you, I'm helping me. And that really is that's the lived reality of being a counselor, is that as you go and you're helping people, you're also helping yourself. And there's such gratification in the work from a spiritual lens, that it really does help you clarify your own values and your own personhood in ways that you can't even imagine at this point. It's just such a valuable it's just an incredible gift to be a counselor, an incredible gift. So I hope all of you are very excited about the future, because it's going to be tremendous for you.
If I could just jump in, I guess I would just like to say that the counseling work I do, I don't view it strictly as spiritual work. I view it as counseling work with a spiritual dimension attached to it, when it's appropriate to bring that spiritual dimension into the conversation. The problem I face so often is the problem of spiritual bypass, where people want to over spiritualize their psychological problems. They want to avoid their psychological pain. They want to defer or refer the problem to God and let God fix it, and not do the psychological work that's necessary. So I try to keep them grounded and focused on their work, their responsibility for the problem to be solved. God may support them, but it's not God's responsibility to solve their problems, if that makes sense.
Kind of sounds like you're talking about this idea of locus of control, right? And perhaps sometimes folks are a little further along in that spectrum. I don't want to misspeak, but is that kind of what you're getting at, Robert?
Well, I think that's part of the picture, yeah. But people can have a deferring style of religious coping, where again they absolve themselves of any responsibility and what have you, to really address the issues and problems and pain that they are feeling, especially the pain.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing that question up and getting some great dialogue going. I want to punt it back to all of our attendees. Is there any question that you'd like to ask any specific panelist, or a question you'd like all of them to share a little bit about? Yeah, Cassie.
I had a question, actually, Pastor Rogers. You just kind of triggered something for me, in the sense that how do you deal with clients who may use religion as a crutch, or not a crutch, but as an excuse for being, discriminatory, or potentially holding on to views or even, actions that they use kind of their religion to cover up?
Can you give me an example, like a conservative white male who would just justify power over his partner, wife, or spouse, etc., that sort
Sure.
of thing?
Mm-hmm.
I pause because it is very challenging, and and again, I want my other panelists to jump in here. It's challenging, and especially when a person is entrenched in their belief system, and especially when they falsely appeal to the authority of Scripture, and misuse it, misinterpret it, and what have you. That requires a lot of work, and of course, I try not to impose my own values, but really engaging the client into really reflecting and thinking through, their beliefs and practices, and if they are healthy, if they are sound, and if there really is a biblical basis.
Thank you for that, Robert. And I'll open that up to Dr. Hillert and Dr. Gosling as well.
Yeah, please. Help me out here.
Dr. Gosling, I guess we'll start with you. Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, that is a tough question. By the way, anybody interested in more on spiritual bypass, one of my mentors, Dr. Jesse Fox, does a lot of research on spiritual bypass, and it's fantastic. So if you're looking at getting into the details of how that happens in clinical work, I highly suggest you look at some of his stuff because he's really good with that. That is a tough question, right? I mean, as Pastor Rogers is indicating, it can be very difficult to work with folks who are in that particular mindset. And I think it goes back a little bit, at least for me, to some of the previous comments about having a little bit of knowledge about all of the traditions, all of the world traditions at least, and understanding some of the differences between those traditions, even within those traditions, the larger traditions. What are the different forms of Christianity? What are the different denominations within America, right? How did that occur? You can get a lot of that information and not that much investment of time and energy. So that helps you kind of contextualize the places in which people have certain systems of belief. And so if you know a little bit about that, then I think it goes a long way toward helping you figure out what's really happening for them. And understanding how powerful tribalism is for people, that to belong to a group is it's an incredibly strong influence in life. And so the more you can recognize that, and that is a lot of what's going on for people in these spaces, is that in order to belong and stay belonging, this is the way, right? And so I don't know, it's on an individual basis though, right? Because if you understand that much and you know a little bit about the traditions and you can kind of contextualize a little bit of where they're coming from or whatever that tradition is, you know, as Pastor Rogers pointed out, a lot of that is just cherry picking scripture, right? So if you have a deeper understanding of that stuff, you can point to, you know, if you have good rapport with them, maybe you can have dialogue about like, well, what about all these other examples from scripture that say the opposite, right? Because, you know, the Bible, the Pentateuch, the New Testament, the Quran, like all of these places, the Upanishads, you know, everything from the Vedic tradition and Buddhism. I mean, it's ultimately, you can find what you want, right? But the core of all of those traditions is love, right? It all comes down to love. And so if you can try to get there with people, you may or may not, as Dr. Awad was pointing out earlier, right? You might not get there, and that's okay. But maybe just planting that little seed with somebody could come to fruition in 10, 20 years, and you will never know, right? But don't think that it's in vain to try to have harder conversations with people when it's warranted and when you've earned their trust to have those conversations.
That's awesome, Dr. Gosling. Thank you so much. And Dr. Hiller, anything you'd like to add?
I don't think there's a whole lot I can add. I think that was covered pretty well. You know, it's sometimes you can have that dialogue. It really depends on where they're at and your relationship with them. Other times it might honestly be better to refocus on what are our goals here in counseling, you know, because they might just be on this diatribe and it's not really related to the goals that you need to work on with them right now. And if you can make progress on just gaining control of anger, gaining control of depression, and just like tackling some other issues, maybe some of those other things are going to be more flexible down the line. So sometimes we maybe defer and come back.
Can I add something to that also?
Please.
Yeah, as like the spokesperson for Dr. Awad, I wish she was here. That also, Cassie's question also made me think of the other side of this coin, is which, because of such people, then there are victims of discrimination, right? So because of people who take scripture without interpretation and apply it in like a violent or discriminatory way, then they become kind of like the face of religion, right? We can see that a lot with Islam, right? Because of ISIS, I'm seen as a terrorist. So I feel like, on the other hand, we might also have clients who have been victims of discrimination, who are spiritual and religious and believe in what Dr. Gosling said. Like for me, the root of Islam is love, but that's not how the media sees Islam. So I feel like that's something to think about too. And for us to like educate ourselves then on the interpretation of different scriptures might help us understand the different nuances between how people apply it in their life.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Zainab. And I recognize we're at the end of our time here, and we want to be mindful. I know many of us have class right after this, so we understand you need a little bit of a break. But again, if we could get a quick round of applause for our amazing panelists, Dr. Hillert, Robert, Dr. Gosling, and Dr. Awad, who of course left. But thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. We hope to engage in more conversations about religion and spirituality in counseling. And so we'll see you next time. Thank you again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Hillert.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, great panel. I love it.
To all of our panelists.
Thank you so much.
So much.
My arm hurts from all the
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Take care.
Close
Take
to
care. Go Montclair State.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Robert.
Oh my goodness. I think. All right. Oh, wait, they left. I didn't realize that. I thought Dr. Hillert and Dr. Gosling were still on. Psych.
Hi, Selena.
Hey, Selena. Oh, you're muted.
Great.
I want to stop recording.
Oh, yeah.